All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Letitia Rose, and I have the pleasure of being your MC for the Reaction Forum today. I am also a member of the Civic Action Board, so on behalf of the Civic Action Board, I'd love to say welcome to all of you. Whether we're meeting physically or virtually, it's so important for us to acknowledge the land that we gather upon. Artist and performer Angela once said, every time a condo goes up in our city, we have to dig down. And every time change happens in our city, we also must manage and examine our foundations. These lands have been the site of human activity for over 12,000 years. So we need to develop a deeper sense of the layers that we stand on. Today, the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area remains the traditional and current Indigenous territories that include the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas of the New Credit, Mississaugas of the Scugog Island First Nation, and we are grateful for the opportunity to work and gather here. Making that land acknowledgement is an act of reconciliation, honoring the land and Indigenous presence, people, and their histories. What does it mean to engage in dialogue to build back better? When we think about it, we should really ask, how do we step beyond land acknowledgements and stand in solidarity with Indigenous communities? As we look at the current climate right now, we also must ask, what does it mean to be an ally in anti-Black racism and fight oppression of other groups in our society? As a Black Canadian woman of Caribbean descent, I take this opportunity to acknowledge my parents who immigrated from Jamaica seeking better opportunity, and my ancestors who were not as lucky to have a choice in their land placement, and the young rising leaders of today who are struggling to feel connected with their identity and their sense of place. As we think about how COVID-19 has impacted our communities, it's really important for us to remember the inequalities of Indigenous people and that others are facing have been exacerbated during this crisis, specifically what we're facing and here to discuss today. Today's agenda is focused in on building back better, specifically how we as a region can build back better in a way that doesn't just work for some, but works for everyone, no matter where you live or what you look like. You'll notice that we have updated our backgrounds behind us, and we invite you to do the same. Now to just share your commitment to recovery and the rebuild effort. Instructions on how to do this would have sent in an email that you would have received a day or two ago to log in for the chat. So a few housekeeping items before we get started. In this session, you're going to be hearing from a lot of amazing leaders and experts, but that doesn't mean that you're off the hook. These sessions are fully intended to be interactive, and we invite you to participate throughout. We'll be seeking your feedback, and we'll be looking for your great questions, which you can ask via our Q&A box. Our panel will be asking some of the top questions from the audience, so make sure you vote up for all the questions that you want to ask by giving a thumbs up and moving them up in priority. We ask that you use the chat functions for comments and for any technical issues that you may be experiencing. This is the first time that Civic Action has done a digital gathering of this size. So we're going to collectively ask for your forgiveness in advance, because technology can always fail and we never know what could happen. So please be patient in joining us in this ride. Are you all ready? Let's get started. I would like to welcome Zabine Hirji, our chair of the board of Civic Action, to this virtual stage to share more about the forum and why it matters and what you can expect for today.
Thank you, Letitia. Good morning, everyone. And it's wonderful to have all you city builders join us for this forum that we've got going this morning and tomorrow. I'm Zabine Hirji, as Letitia pointed out, and I'm so proud to serve as the board chair of CivicAction. Now, around this time last year, we had just held our summit to reset the agenda with a slate of new issues. Today, we find ourselves gathering again, albeit virtually this time, to address some of the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. It goes without saying that COVID-19 has disrupted our lives in so many ways. But this shared predicament has also united us in ways I haven't seen before. It can feel like we've gone through a time machine, both propelling us ahead in some areas and behind in others. In the world of work, for example, what was expected to take years has happened in weeks. On the other hand, millions of Canadians have lost their jobs. Young people, new immigrants, people of color, and women have been disproportionately impacted. The pandemic has also revealed how deep systematic issues of racism are, in particular anti-Black racism, and the inequality so many groups still face. It has amplified some uncomfortable truths. These are not some other country's problems. They are here, they are real. Bold action with a sense of urgency is the only way to create change. Let's seize the moment. I would like to take a moment to get a little bit personal here to amplify the voices of 6 individuals who've taught me so much over the years through their willingness to eloquently share some of these uncomfortable truths, propose solutions, and act on them. Thank you to Dr. Eugenia Addy, Mark Beckles, Orlando Bowen, Emily Mills, Dr. Kofi Hope, and Cheryl Chokatam. I do encourage all of you that are with us today to read their recent stories and messages, which you can find online. While it was painful and even heartbreaking for me, it was a very important reminder to do more. During COVID-19, we've seen so many people dedicated to keeping our communities safe and healthy. I'm deeply grateful to the frontline workers and volunteers across the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area. You are nothing short of remarkable. The thousands of stories of acts of kindness are heartwarming, and it is really my hope that this care and compassion will continue post-COVID. I'm also proud to see CivicAction Diversity Fellows and ELNers sitting at important tables with mayors, with ministers, with economic recovery teams, making your voices count in the recovery efforts. Now is the time to invest more in our people and challenge leaders in new ways. The pandemic has also shown us how interconnected we are. We've seen the different levels of government work together and impactful cross-sector collaboration, business, government, not-for-profits, and civil society. This is the way of the future. Big, complex problems can't be solved in isolation. In order to unlock the full potential of all people, all organizations, and of Canada, we will need to collaborate and co-create in new ways, to listen, to experiment, to learn together. CivicAction's secret sauce is convening leaders from all sectors, bringing next-gen and diverse voices to the table, so both the usual and the unusual suspects are there together and collectively taking action. And our true superpower as humans is to trust one another and to work together. So let's build back better, starting today. Let's build inclusive prosperity for all. Let me close now by thanking the elected officials who are joining us over the next 2 days. The Honorable Rod Phillips, Minister of Finance and Chair of the Ontario Jobs and Recovery Committee, the Honorable Jill Dunlop, Associate Minister of Children and Women's Issues, the Honorable Michael Tibolo, Associate Minister of Mental Health and Addictions, MPP Mitzi Hunter, MPP Vijay Thanigasalam, His Worship John Tory, Mayor of the City of Toronto, His Worship Patrick Brown, Mayor of the City of Brampton, Toronto City Councillor Brad Bradford, and Brampton City Councillors Rowena Santos and Charmaine Williams. Thank you for being with us. And it is now my great pleasure to turn it over to Tamara Ballin, our interim CEO of CivicAction. Over to you, Tamara.
Thank you, Zabine. And good morning, everyone. I'm Tamara Ballin, and I'm the interim CEO of CivicAction. At CivicAction, our purpose is to bring leaders together to build better cities. And it's easy to see why coming together and working together is so important right now. We're actually facing two viruses, COVID-19 and racism. And we are seeing people take huge risks, experience a lot of pain, and it's taking a toll on their well-being. Today's a chance for all of us to sit up, to listen harder, to engage deeper, but most importantly, to do better. Our collective mission over the next 2 days is to focus on meaningful action and change. We will be working on 3 interconnected issues facing our region: employment of young people, mental well-being, and trust. First, many young people were already facing numerous barriers, many systemic, related to employment. The number of youth and young adults in Canada who are out of work has skyrocketed. Do you remember your first job? It might have felt like a ticket to your future opportunities. We need to ensure that we don't have a COVID generation that's economically scarred and left out by this crisis. Second, we know that trust is associated with stronger economic growth and better health outcomes. Amid the pandemic, trust in Canada went up. But recent events have also showed us what happens when trust is lost, or when trust was never built in the first place. Although we live in one of the most diverse places in the world, as Canadians and as individuals in the GTHA, it's important to acknowledge how we've been complicit in systemic racism and inequality, and how we have an obligation to take action. We need to work relentlessly to dismantle the deep roots of anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism, and the injustices that other groups face. Together, let's find ways to grow trust and strengthen the connective tissue that binds us. Third, feeling lonely often is linked to early death, on par with smoking and obesity. Isolation and loneliness were already a pre-existing condition in our region. During the pandemic, more than half of Canadians report feeling lonely and isolated. How can we make people feel more connected? Let's consider this morning. On the one hand, going virtual has meant we're in many different parts of the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area, connecting the dots across the region. But on the other hand, it means we can't really look each other in the eye. So consider how to bring the same sensibilities you would meeting face-to-face to the discussions. There is no question a crisis like this tests our resolve. It is our chance to build a better community. And I know a network like this, like you, can do it. In summary, we're here to do 3 things. 1, build connections. 2, build actions. 3, start to build back better. It's a tall order, but we're CivicAction, not civic chit-chat, and we're here to get things done. We've tabled 3 issues and laid out 3 objectives. Now 5 thank yous. Just a few weeks ago, our board and team agreed we needed to bring leaders together. And since then, a small but mighty team has worked hard to host today's forum. Thank you to the best colleagues, especially Sarah, Leslie, Jeff, Karita, Allison, Magda, and Jody for making today possible. Thank you to our facilitation partner, Deloitte. The Deloitte Greenhouse team has designed and will take us through a dynamic and collaborative and interactive process in the labs. Thank you also to our communication partner, Edelman, for helping us share our message. To our board chairs, Zabine and Tim, and our board directors, thank you for your commitment to collective civic action. And finally, a thank you to the dozens of companies, foundations, and individual donors who make our work possible, with special thanks to those who've supported the Reaction Forum with a personal donation. Now, let's get to work. Let's build back better. Over to you, Letitia.
Thank you, Tamara, for those amazing, for the amazing opening, and as you as well, Zabine. Next up, we have our panel discussion, where we will start to dive into the issues of the forum agenda. As a reminder, we encourage you to ask questions via the Q&A box and to upvote for the questions that you want asked by clicking a thumbs up so it moves up in priority. Moderating the panel today is Farah Nasser. Farah is an award-winning journalist, bringing an extensive experience to her role as anchor of global news at 5:30 and 6 p.m. Our panelists today are Nick Chambers, partner with Boyden Executive Search, focusing on healthcare, higher education, and the not-profit sectors. Tai Huyen, creative director at Open Labs, a design and innovation studio at the University Health Network, dedicated to human-centered approach for advancing health and social determinants. Lisa Kimmel, who oversees Edelman's Canadian and Latin American operations, and also sits on Edelman's Global Operations Committee, and one of my fellow CivicAction board members. And John Stackhouse, Senior Vice President of the Office of the CEO at RBC. Now I'll turn the discussion over to you, Farah.
Thank you so much for that, Letitia, and thanks for having me. I am honored to be back to moderate a panel and have a really important discussion. And to our panelists who are here, thank you for being here to kick things off today. And I think we should start off with a conversation, acknowledging the inequality that already exists and has been exacerbated through the pandemic, and the coming to surface of all the inequality that's existed in our country and south of the border. Now, these issues, obviously, they're not new, but we have seen that we have a lot of work to do when it comes to anti-Black racism, to injustices against Indigenous Canadians and racialized residents. So when COVID-19 first hit, we were calling it the great equalizer because, no matter how much you made, where you lived, you could get the virus, you could get the disease. But when we looked closer and we dug deeper into data, we saw that while anyone can catch COVID-19, not everyone experiences a pandemic in the same way. Those from marginalized communities, from vulnerable communities are disproportionately impacted. So with all that in mind, I'm going to put this first question to all of our panelists. And Lisa, perhaps I can start with you. What do you think COVID-19 has shown us about inequality in our region, and how can we use this experience to better level the playing field?
Thanks, Farah. I'm thrilled to be here today. So Edelman has been doing a global survey for the last 20 years called the Edelman Trust Barometer that looks at trust across 4 institutions: business, government, media, and NGOs. And what we've seen in Canada over the last number of years is that there is, in fact, a growing trust inequality that exists between the elites, or what we define as the informed public. So those who are in the top quartile of income earners in the country, they're also college educated and they're higher consumers of media, relative to the mass population. And we do this survey on an annual basis, but this year we decided in the midst of the pandemic that we should go back into field to see how Canadians and other respondents in 11 countries around the world are feeling as it relates to trust in institutions. And one of the interesting findings in Canada was that the pandemic has really put a spotlight on societal inequities. And in fact, 60% of respondents feel that it's really made them finally realize just how big a gap exists in this country between the rich and the working class, and that something in fact needs to be done in order to more fairly distribute the country's wealth and prosperity. And so this is a critical moment in time where those in the elite and leadership in government as well as in the business community need to figure out and come to the table with solutions in order to bridge that gap where polarization is concerned.
Okay, John, I'll turn it over to you next. What can we do to build back better through the lens of inequality?
Yeah, thanks, Farah. One of the points that is starting to become much clearer is the unequal impact in terms of employment and certainly the economic consequences through the crisis. So there's been the virus, but then there's been the recessionary impact. We have a new report out today from RBC called Small Business Big Pivot, which looks at the profound damage to small businesses of the recession so far in Canada, twice the job loss rate in small businesses, and a much higher impact on women, visible minorities, Indigenous Canadians, and youth in terms of both business ownership, and employment. So when we start to think about building back and building back better, we're arguing that we have to leverage small business, entrepreneurs, which includes a lot of new Canadians. 25% of small businesses in this country are owned by new Canadians. It's an incredible on-ramp into the Canadian economy. So focusing much more on small business, and this is something we're stressing to every group we can, is critical to the recovery. We also have to think about the social infrastructure and economic infrastructure that a lot of enterprises rely on. And that's critical in big cities like Toronto. We're not going to get those small businesses going, which will create jobs and better livelihoods, if we don't focus on transit and childcare, particularly. Those are sort of two of the most acute challenges in Canadian cities. And as we know, cities have a deepening financial challenge. We put out another study this week that showed there's a $12 billion gap this year for Canadian cities, and they will not be able to fund that infrastructure like transit. And as a result, we won't get small businesses back going, which won't allow Canadians of all backgrounds to re-engage in the economy. Lots of other questions about distribution and redistribution in our society, which we can talk about. But I thought it was important to lay that foundation, that this is a small business recession, and the recovery is going to have to be led by entrepreneurs, owners, and operators of all kinds, and we'll need to focus on the infrastructure that they need to get going.
John, I'm going to turn it over to Nick now, because you can probably respond to this, Nick, in terms of the executive search point of view, the jobs point of view. What's your thought on handling inequality and building back?
Thanks very much, Farah, and good morning, everyone. I would echo a number of the comments that have been made already, and add perhaps that I think we're in a time where we're having to face truths that many of us would rather not acknowledge, whether it's the paradox of the essential worker, meaning that we're dependent on people who, as a society, we sometimes find it easy to take for granted or ignore. We talk a lot about the virtues of failing, and the learning and innovation that result from failing fast and failing often. But is it really okay for everyone to fail, or is that a privilege afforded to some? So I think we need to be having some honest conversations about these truths and deciding whether we are okay with treating people as human beings as dispensable, and whether we need to reframe how we value the contributions that others have to make. A quick story for you. I once interviewed a bright, accomplished woman whose resume included a somewhat chaotic looking 2 or 3 year period. There was a short-lived full-time stint, a part-time stint, some ambiguous sounding consulting. It turns out that her elderly mother was ill during that period. Her mother was incapable of navigating the healthcare system for herself, and my candidate had no choice but to take a leave and eventually quit her full-time job so that she could care for her mother. When her mother's health improved, she would take on a contract. When it worsened, she would scale back again. And I just wonder how many stories like that are going to emerge out of this pandemic, and how we will interpret career disruption, how much weight we'll give to entrepreneurial ventures, to echo one of John's points a moment ago, how we'll value community leadership, a return to school, a mental health pause, or a change in career direction that didn't work out. We're going to have to look at and treat each other differently going forward.
Certainly, we're going to have to dig deep and look deep. Ty, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, I'll speak about this from my perspective at the lab, where we do a lot of work with seniors. As we know, the hardest hit population as far as mortality from COVID has been the seniors population, especially those that live in long-term care. But I think what we forget about are the thousands upon thousands of seniors who are still living independently in their own homes, apartments, et cetera. And that's the segment that we've been doing a lot of work. We started at the beginning of COVID, something called the Friendly Neighbor Hotline. And it's really trying to address this issue of low-income seniors who live in social housing that, because of COVID, are not going out for groceries, medications, et cetera, for fear of catching COVID. And many of them actually aren't, they're facing the digital divide as well on top of everything else. So aren't able to use some of the technologies that we use to stay connected with friends and family, nor to go online and access grocery gateways and things of that nature. So we've been going out, with a volunteer base of 1,000 people in the city of Toronto to help these seniors actually access these things. But I think the reality is their experience with COVID is going to drag on a lot longer than it is for the rest of us because of their vulnerability. And so I think we have to really think about how we continue to offer these types of supports to these seniors. I think we've known for a long time that seniors are quite isolated. They live in a big city like Toronto, and one of the paradoxes of that is being isolated in a big city, like this oxymoron of being alone together. Like many of them are living very in close proximities to others, maybe separated by a wall or ceiling from other seniors and other people, and yet they're kind of trapped. And the social isolation that they felt during other times is now kind of magnified, because you're throwing on top of that not only social isolation but physical isolation. So it's not a good situation. And one of the things that we're getting a lot of phone calls about through our hotline is just seniors not calling us just because they need some of these basic essentials, but because they're lonely, they have anxiety, and they're feeling depression. And so there's a lot of referral outs to other agencies, social workers, to help them with these kinds of issues. So I think from that vantage point, I think we have to really think about that segment of the population that maybe isn't so much in the mainstream media or being talked about.
Thank you, Ty, for that perspective, that important perspective. Now, throughout this pandemic, we have seen incredible hardship, and Ty, as you mentioned, we've seen unimaginable loss, but we've also seen a glimmer of hope in a way with displays of community and innovation and transformation. We've seen everyday citizens organizing PPE drives and launching community support programs. We've seen levels of government work together like they never have before. We've seen policy and legislative change happen that usually takes weeks or years happen within days. So with the theme of Build Back Better in mind, and Nick, I'll start with you on this one. What's one legacy or one lesson you hope we take away from this experience?
Yeah, I'm hoping, I'm optimistic, and I'm hoping that empathy and deep listening are going to play a stronger role. I see them as critical to the wellness of our society. It shouldn't take a state of emergency, the loss of a loved one, or frankly, video evidence of a lynching for us to recognize oppression and suffering. So I would say empathy and deep listening.
Yeah, that's a good point. Ty?
One of the things I've been amazed by really is just volunteerism happening. in the city. I'd like to see that keep up. You know, I think one of the first set of services to shut down during the early days of the pandemic was really things like food bank, et cetera, because most of the volunteer base were seniors themselves who were quite vulnerable. And I think it's what's been amazing is, you know, volunteerism is now spread to a segment of younger, you know, individuals that perhaps at other times wouldn't be as interested in this kind of work. And so I'd like to see stuff like that just, you know, keep going in the days ahead or years ahead.
Lisa.
I would say collaboration and partnership. You know, you, Vara, mentioned the collaboration amongst various levels of government that have been so instrumental to our fight against the pandemic in Canada. But I also think that there's wonderful examples of partnership between businesses and government in terms of production of PPE, but also businesses within the same industries who are actually collaborating. So I think one of the wonderful examples is the pharma industry that has come together in the search for a vaccine and working in collaboration for a common cause that's in the best interests of society, as opposed to being motivated simply by self-interest.
John, what have we learned, and both through the pandemic, but also through the lens of what we're seeing in terms of the fight against anti-Black racism? What have we learned right now in this moment with what Tamara talked about as two viruses that'll carry us in the future?
Yeah, it's a profound question. I think we need to reflect on the fact that collective action works. We're seeing this. We shut down a global economy in a matter of weeks. And there were serious concerns in March that this would lead to unprecedented devastation, led to extraordinary damage. I'm not underestimating that. But, you know, knock on wood, this could have been horrifically worse, both from a public health outcome and from an economic outcome from what we've seen. And the collective action from community leaders, from business leaders, from healthcare leaders, but most importantly from millions and really billions of people around the planet who realized that there was a greater good at stake here. And we all could do our part. Sure, we've screwed up in all sorts of ways, but I don't think when we look back on this, we will be able to find many other times in history when humanity has worked together for a common cause. Now we're seeing that in a different way, and it's still early to tell in terms of the fight against racism. But again, we are seeing the power of collective action to stand up to some of the most powerful forces, not just in the world, be it the White House or other institutions, but even around us in communities, against forces, the police, first and foremost, for the public to be able to collectively and calmly stand up, use facts. And I think one of the connective tissues of these two issues actually is the power of fact. You know, we live in this age where we think facts don't matter anymore. It's all, you know, fake news. Well, you know what? Facts do. When you're fighting a pandemic, you lay out the facts to the public. People are smart. They'll respond. They know what to do. Just give them some choices. Give them the facts. We're seeing the same in the racism debate. When you lay out facts, and that video was a fact, that was something that people were able to mobilize around. They see something that is real, that is factual, and they say, okay, I know now what I can do. So the power of collective action, and the power of fact, I hope are two things that we can take forward.
Yeah, and at the same time, you know, you look at it and it takes a video like this. It takes a video proof to get people around something that, you know, many in the Black community have been talking about for decades. Let's move on now to jobs. 1 in 7, that's roughly how many Canadians lost their jobs since February. 1 in 4 is how many lost their jobs, or at least most of their hours. And when you look back, I mean, these unemployment numbers, we haven't seen these type of numbers since the Great Depression. And then you add to that this moment, again, as we zero in on inequality and anti-Black racism, there's a reckoning of sorts in big corporations that are sending out press releases when it comes to, you know, anti-racism initiatives but then you look at leadership roles in those very same companies and there's not a lot of diversity. So Nick, thinking about both those things, how are executives and recruiters approaching hiring as a result of the moment we're in, this double moment we're in both the short and long term?
Yeah, I'm getting a lot of calls on that topic.
I'm sure.
And I would say that, first of all, a lot of organizations are scrambling. There's some who've been working at this for a long time, and others who, for whom this is somewhat of a wake-up call. And I think many of them are recognizing that these changes can't be made overnight. It takes investment. It takes changes in policy. It takes some sacrifice, some difficult decisions and difficult conversations. So I would say in the short term, organizations have been kind of wrestling with the mechanics of how do I hire people who I can't meet in person? How do I onboard people virtually who, you know, are working from home for the first several weeks, months, or whatever of their tenure? But I think coming out of that, there are deeper discussions about what new skills do we need going forward, what new or redesigned roles do we need going forward. So what role is risk management going to play? And you see with some of these roles that, you know, your senior risk management person, or your senior diversity and inclusion person, or your senior government relations person is actually getting closer and closer to the top of the organization because of the prominence of that activity and the importance of that role. So a fresh look at skills, at roles. And I think we're also, and this has been a long time coming, we're also re-looking at how we assess things like experience and potential. And the traditional job ad for a leadership role says 20 years of experience in. And if we're truly to be more inclusive and open the doors to others who bring a mix of skills that were accumulated in other than the conventional route or conventional path, what does that look like? How do you assess? How do you and how do you support those people if in fact you're taking a gamble that you might not have taken previously?
And Nick, just to kind of bring it down a little bit, for young adults, right? If there's people who are younger watching us, what are the 3 skills would you say that they need to future-proof themselves and help them get a job?
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to cheat a little bit and give you 3 skill clusters.
Okay.
So the first one I would say is adaptability and the ability to manage your own personal and professional development. Business scholars and industrial psychologists have been predicting for a while now that volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity would become the norm in organizations, and they were right. That's what we're seeing. So young people, mid-career people, late career people need to be adept at navigating turbulent waters and adapting. To echo a point that John made, evidence-based decision-making is going to be critical, and I would pair that with design thinking. I find it interesting that the big data era and the post-truth era have coincided. So critical thinking, data science, storytelling, and human-centered design will be key to cutting through the noise and solving problems. And the third one, I'm working on what may become my new favorite interview question, and it's something along the lines of, tell me about a time that you used your privilege or gave something up to create space for someone else to shine or to grow. So that piece about empowering others, amplifying others' talents, allyship, I think there's a skill set there that everyone needs to be developing, not just those who lead and manage others.
I love that question. I just wrote it down because I think it's definitely a key question that a lot of leaders should look at when they're making hiring decisions. We spoke about this younger generation. So while many have been, of course, impacted by the economic fallout, Gen Z, Generation Z, I should say, that's the cohort now entering the workforce, and they're facing an economic crisis. We're facing an economic crisis that we haven't seen in a century, but they are the most likely to kind of bear the scars of this throughout their lifetime. So not just even at this moment. So John, as one of Canada's largest employers, what's one thing that businesses can do to help those impacted by job loss, upskill for their next job, and also stay hopeful?
Far and away, work integrated learning, which we're good at this country, and we got to get great at it in a hurry. Co-ops, internships, apprenticeships need to be a way of life for every student and every employer, public and private sector in this country. It has to be a way of life. So as if you're learning, you also got to be working, and if you're working, you got to be learning. And the interconnectivity of schools and workplaces is going to become deeper and deeper. So every employer has to seize on this moment, which may be tough because of all the other pressures. But you know what? That's always the moment that people regret not seizing on an opportunity. This is the moment to seize on these opportunities, to hire students, to create internships, hard as that may be. We at RBC have 1,500 students working for us this summer. We had a big debate in April about shutting down the program because how could we bring them into, we don't have a workplace. Every one of those students pretty much is now working virtually for us. They've never met the people they're working with, and they're shooting the lights out. I mean, it's just been a great, great move. They're teaching us, we're learning from them, but they're also learning from us in different ways, and we're creating new solutions to problems. They're going to go back to school and demand that the schools go about education differently, which they have to. So this integration of work and learning is going to be really powerful for our recovery, not just in economic terms, in social inclusion terms, because this is work integrated learning. We've come to see as the great democratizer. It gives people work experience if they don't have that privilege. Not always. We've got a lot of challenges to work out there, but it is a leveler, not an equalizer, a social leveler, because it brings, in our case, lots of students who may not know anyone at RBC, but they get a work placement at RBC as part of their schooling. That often leads to a full-time job, if not with us, with another good employer, and on it goes. So we have to see this as an economic opportunity, but also a really important part of building the social fabric of a different and better Canada.
This is, it's so innovative to have these students work in a way that we are all going to start working even more. Any other quick wins that you've had there?
Work from home is a really important challenge for us to continue to think about, because there is a risk that it favors the privileged. Like, we're all able to do this because we have our own space, have our own homes, have our own infrastructure. It's much harder for people in different jobs, especially those essential, so-called essential worker jobs that were referenced earlier, who may not have the physical environment, may not have the capacity, may not have the household set up that allows them to work from home. So as we shift to a greater work from home model, it's not going to be binary, it'll be a blended model, but there will be a lot more working from home in the years ahead. We need to think about how to enable households and communities to take advantage of this. It's not just employers taking advantage of people working from home, it's individuals and communities taking advantage of this, because it's going to up their value, up their ability to manage both personal and professional challenges, to reduce stresses that come into everyone's life through having to balance the many demands of a working life, but it's not going to happen automatically. We can't leave it just to the market to take us forward. So no answers there, I'm sorry, but I think it's an important question, especially for a big city like Toronto, to think through. How do we become kind of a working from home, dynamic, progressive, and productive working from home community?
No answer, but some really good questions there. Let's zero in on mental health because that's an important aspect of this. I mean, since the pandemic began, programs have been launched at all levels of government to support mental health, to support wellness, but residents, also experts in this field, are really bracing for a mental health crisis still that's triggered by, ongoing economic worry, by personal safety, by worry for the wellness of friends and family. In fact, the United Nations is saying that mental health is one of the most neglected areas during this pandemic. Ty, you spoke about your friendly neighborhood hotline initiative. I want to hear more about that, your research into vertical communities for seniors, but also, Ty, the misconceptions around loneliness and isolation.
Yeah, I think, we all have, maybe from the movies or so, this idea that seniors live in these suburban bungalows, with the driveway and the car and everything. But I think the reality is in big urban centers like Toronto, Mississauga, a huge percentage. Last time I looked in the last census, 36% of seniors in the city of Toronto live in high rises. And, there's something to be said about that, the fact that we're living in such close proximity to each other, intergenerational proximity, and yet we have issues of isolation, physical and social. So, I think I do a lot of work with seniors through the lab, even prior to COVID. And one of the greatest fears that many of these seniors have is dying alone in their own apartment and no one finding them for days. Like, that is the number one fear among seniors. And, I think what have been trying to do is figure out a way to unlock the social capital in these micro settings of, let's say, in an apartment building where you have younger people and older people living co-located, and to check up on each other, knock on the door, see how you're doing. I know it's difficult right now during COVID, but perhaps, as we get out of this, we can find a way to, try to do that for each other. But, I think the reality is, seniors is very difficult and challenging for a number of reasons, including the technology divide that I mentioned earlier. The hotline that we set up is really old school. You can think of it as, almost you take something like Amazon or Grocery Gateway and roll back the clock by 2 decades, where we have a 1-855 toll-free hotline available in 180 languages, and seniors who need meds pickup, grocery pickup, food bank pickup, which is called that. And we have staff, a virtual call center that would field those calls, check up on them, and then send out whatever they need to volunteers. The 1,000 volunteers we have in the city of Toronto, structured into 25 teams according to the wards, and they would go out and do this, this kind of work for seniors for free. So it's been really rewarding. But our call center, I remember, one of the first shift for one of our call center volunteers, this gentleman received a phone call from a senior that's just so depressed that, he threatened to kill himself. And, it was horrific as a experience for somebody who's really gone into this for the very first shift. And I think, and those types of issues have really, I would say, it's pretty anecdotal, but we've seen more and more of those cases. And as a result, have had to bring on some of the experts from 211, et cetera, to help train our staff on crisis management and, how to deal with some of these things, and then build partnerships to link them out. And, if you look at the 211 numbers, a huge percentage, I think up to 10% of their calls, and they get lots of phone calls nowadays from folks, in double digits now, these phone calls are about mental health issues. And I think the numbers have been on the rise as the pandemic drags on. So these are kind of, I think, realities that, we face, although we wanted to provide pickup of basic essentials like food, et cetera, you can't help but confront and having to deal with some of these other, I guess, more complex issues related to mental health and wellness.
Such important work you're doing, Ty, right now, especially. Let's talk about trust. Trust isn't something that many of us actively think about, yet it's such an important ingredient when we talk about recovery and rebuilding. And it really does impact us daily, whether we realize it or not. So, for example, do we trust our leaders to make the right decisions on our behalf? Do we trust our employer to keep us safe, to do the right thing? There's big questions here. Lisa, how have you seen the public's trust for government and institutions evolve during this crisis?
So it's interesting. Over the last number of years, both globally as well as in Canada, we have seen a gradual decline in trust across all institutions, but in particular in government. What our data, and this past year, when we did our survey, it was in field during the time of the federal election. And typically, because we've been doing this study for the last 20 years, we've seen a trend that when there is a new an election and there is a new government that comes into power, that you typically see a significant rise in trust in government, because there's optimism around that change, that things are going to progress and move forward. And this past year, we actually did not see that in Canada. When we put the survey in field during the pandemic, we actually saw a 20-point increase in trust in government in Canada. And when we talk about government, we're not specific, so it really does encompass all three levels of government. So government in Canada, from when our survey was in field in the fall to late April, moved from 4th position of the 4 institutions that we measure to the 1st position. And I think that that is a testament to the collaboration and partnership that we have seen across different levels of government, but also across party lines in the fight, and a commitment to working together to fight both the pandemic and then also the economic fallout from it. So I think that though we're probably in what I would define as a trust bubble right now, particularly where government is concerned, that there has been significant actions on behalf of Canadians to help to support them through the pandemic. But will that trust remain and continue, given that now expectations are so high for government to help Canadian businesses and organizations to get out of what we're currently experiencing in this crisis.
Okay, thanks, Lisa. I'm going to now go over to audience questions. I have a few, but we have some great ones from the audience that I want to get to. And I'm going to ask all of you this, but we'll start with Nick. If you could change one thing about the GTHA, one policy change, what would it be?
I'm going to sit on that one for a little.
Okay. Ty, do you have an answer for that?
Same, yeah. Let me just give it some thought. Thank you.
Okay. Anyone else? John? It's a really, really tough question, but it's a good one.
It's a great one. And I had the advantage of being able to think about it for a couple
seconds.
Couple of seconds. This isn't the most profound idea, but maybe it's something that's actionable, which is to find ways to turn libraries and community centers across the region into remote work centers, so that people can work remotely, but walk somewhere from their home, get away from their home. Something that is probably, I'm sure there's all sorts of reasons not to do it, but probably something that is fairly easy, straightforward, and could be a real powerful engine for people to re-engage in the future.
And a concrete step, which is also good to hear. Lisa, do you have any ideas about this one?
I'm still sitting on that one.
You're still sitting on it. Nick and Ty?
Well, so where my mind is going is in the direction of a topic we've been talking about for a long time around credentials and the steps that we take to recognize the skills and experiences that newcomers bring. And so, I could see cities and governments being leaders in setting an example for clearing the barriers to whether it's a foreign trained physician or a foreign trained engineer or someone who has led an organization in a faraway place, and actually, as I said, removing the barriers to those folks stepping into roles of responsibility. I could see the public sector taking a lead on that.
And that's something, again, we've been talking about for a long time, but now there's perhaps more urgency to tackle that one. Ty and Lisa, I'll give you a chance to respond to what is one policy change that you would make in the GTHA?
Sorry, you were cutting out there just for a sec.
Oh, I was just I just wanted to know your thoughts on one policy change, one concrete policy change in the GTHA that you'd like to see.
Mm-hmm. I think I'd like to see, more emphasis on affordable housing and how to deal with, obviously, homelessness, things of that nature. I think that's certainly one of the sectors that's really been hit super hard by all of this. So definitely see some opportunities there for the city and municipalities and various levels of government to step up their game on that.
Lisa?
I think diversity and inclusion and making that more of a priority. I think that, there's a lot of talk around the importance of diversity and inclusion, and yet there hasn't necessarily been actions to ensure that workplaces are truly reflective of the Canadian population. And so leaders need to put actions behind their words on this particular topic.
Okay. There's a question here that just keeps coming to the top, and it's for you, Nick, but this person also wants to hear what other panelists generally have to say. It's, as many companies are now acting in a reactionary manner rather than proactively due to recent events, how do we ensure that when candidates from intersectionally marginalized backgrounds are hired, promoted, that they are not blamed for failures that systemic racism and other forms of oppression bring about?
Yeah, I appreciate that question, and it's a big one and an important one. So a few things come to mind. One, I think we need to think beyond the hire, which is to say, what ongoing supports are put in place for people stepping into roles, particularly if it's, that should be a question we ask for everyone, but especially in the instance that we're describing here, someone from a marginalized group, what supports are being put in place, what mentoring, whether it's peer mentoring or from someone more senior in the organization. We need to be careful about the one and done phenomenon. We like to celebrate the first, whether it's the first Black woman to be the CEO of organization X or the first Indigenous person to lead organization Y. There's a huge burden placed on people who are first. And so to what extent are we thinking that through, supporting them, not concluding that the job is done once we have one person in through the door. And I did take a peek at the Q&A. There was also a question about where should equity and diversity sit within the organization. Mm-hmm. And I think the answer is as close to the CEO's office as possible. And so when you have people who are trained, skilled equity and diversity professionals working on all aspects of inclusivity in an organization, you're much more likely to create the conditions for someone to succeed.
Nick, just picking up on something that Lisa said, I mean, she spoke about a policy change for diversity and inclusion. What do you see as a concrete solution right now in terms of that? Like what concrete steps can businesses and government take to make a real change?
So I work with a number of universities and healthcare organizations, many of whom are kind of leading edge when it comes to equity, diversity, and inclusion. And and some of the things that they're doing are having candidates self-identify through the process, through the recruitment process, so that at the outset you can see whether the pool is representative of the community that you're serving. As you move to a narrowed list, is that balance continuing, or are we losing people as the list gets narrower? And if so, pump the brakes and ask the question why, and revisit. Head back out to market. So I think there's data that we can be using to inform the in recruitment steps that we're taking. And then I also think, and I mentioned earlier, that this question of experience versus potential, and I think there's a lot of literature that we're seeing that suggests that in of itself, an insistence on decades of experience can be one of the greatest inhibitors to someone from an equity-seeking group being given the opportunity to compete for a role. So the self-identification and changing our expectations around the experience piece.
We only have a couple minutes left, but John, I want to direct this question to you. It is, do you foresee basic minimum income become more likely due to the experiment with the CERB?
I suspect we'll see a lot of debate around that and have concerns that if it's not very carefully designed, it becomes counterproductive. We need to learn from the CERB experience, and we're still in the middle of it, so learn as we go, but there'll be an important pause and reflect moment maybe a few months from now. But I have reservations about UBI, Universal Basic Income, watching it tested in different ways around the world. It's good in theory and pretty risky in practice, including the risk that it poses to a lot of social programs that are already in place, need to be refined, maybe need to be improved, both in terms of how they're structured and the levels that they offer. But let's also reflect on the systems we have in place that do work. And if I can just seize on that point to speak to the inclusion point, something I've learned from Zabine, who brought me into RBC and was a bit of a mentor, is inclusion is a choice. Diversity is a fact. And we have to see the choice as one of as an opportunity, not an obligation. And that includes not just for companies, but for our communities. And Toronto especially, a lot of things to improve on, but this is one of the most inclusive places and big cities in the world. Let's reflect on what's working and improve on that, as well as what we can add to that, because it's important to build on successes that you have, as well as look to new ideas.
Well, any lesson from Zabine is a great way to close this session. So thank you for that. And as Tamara pointed out, this isn't Civic Chit Chat, this is Civic Action. So I hope our audience is listening to this discussion, and as thought leaders, as civil society leaders, we take some action on these two pivotal movements that are happening right now at the same time. Thank you so much for having me, and I'll turn it over, and to our panelists, of course, and I'll turn it over to Letitia.
Thank you, Farah, and thank you, panelists, for an amazing discussion. Here to introduce our next speaker is Rob McIsaac, President and CEO of Hamilton Health Sciences.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Well, I think we're off to a great start, and it's wonderful to see so many people coming together and committing to work collaboratively at getting our region moving again. Although Civic Action has traditionally brought people together in the physical world, today's virtual forum still feels like a natural space for Civic Action to create. We've always been mostly about bringing people's hearts and minds together In so doing, we can suss out the wisdom of the crowd on these complex issues we've been discussing. These past 3.5 months have been tough on our city region. As the head of Hamilton Health Sciences, I've really had a front row seat to the hardship that COVID-19 has created. The costs have been enormous, both to our economy, but also to so many people's lives. But there's also been so much about what is good in our region on display too. Amazing resilience, courage, dedication, and compassion. And as we begin to think about what the end game looks like to this ordeal, I strongly believe that all the fundamentals that have created our past economic and social successes pre-COVID remain in place. And that makes me optimistic for our future. We can and we will come out of this as one of North America's great city regions. But importantly, we have an opportunity to do it in a way that takes into account some of the hard lessons we've observed over the past few months. We have a chance to come back better. And there are few people better suited to leading this effort than Mayor John Tory. Anyone can lead when times are good. The test of leadership comes during times of crisis. And I think we've been fortunate to have a leader like John Tory in our region these past few months. Mayor Tory has shown tremendous leadership, transparency, and humility during this crisis. He knows the power of groups like the one we've gathered today, and I know he'll stand beside us in our collective efforts. Welcome, Mayor Tory. Thanks for your leadership to Civic Action and for being here today. We're very excited to hear from you.
I just pressed a button to unmute myself. Did I succeed?
You did.
Oh, good. Okay. Well, Rob, thank you for those kind words, and thank you to Civic Action for inviting me to be a small part of this. And I'm just going to say a few words. I watched the panel because I wanted to sort of get a sense of the discussion, and there was so much I could respond to, and I would have had an answer ready for that question about the single policy change, and it would have been in the area of affordable housing in my own case. But I just want to say I'm obviously a believer, and when Rob talked about standing beside leaders and leaders standing beside Civic Action, I think you all know I was under the leadership of David Pico, one of the founders of Civic Action and a past chair, and I so much believe in its continuing mandate and how important it is, first among all of the different groups that, of course, we hear from and value their participation. And I just want to deal with, in the Civic Action tradition, I want to sort of put a challenge out to each of three groups: business, government, and then the sort of the community at large, people, in the context of the things you're talking about today. And there's so many things you could make a mention of. But I guess in the case of business, if there was one thing, speaking to the question of employment and opportunity and so on, that is so much a part of your discussion today, I really think that business is going to have to do a much better job. And we have only taken some steps in this direction ourselves as government, but I think business has to do a much better job reaching out to include people. There was just reference a moment or two ago to inclusion. And I think that, one of the things we used to say about Civic Action in the early days is you would sit down at a table sponsored by Civic Action, and it would not be the usual suspects there. It would be some unusual suspects. There'd be people sitting next to each other who, wouldn't traditionally sit next to each other. And if you can adopt the same approach, business can. I mean, I think that we have to do a much better job of reaching out to bring people into the ranks of the employed. If you think about it, and I was up at a seminar, and I've told the story many times because it had such a huge impact on me in the Somali community, and they were talking about their kids who are getting in trouble, more often than they should because they are not as occupied with one thing and the next, whether it's a job or being in school or whatever, and they're getting into trouble. And the moms who were there, because the moms have a group that are sort of activists on this, said to me, Mr. Tory, we told our kids to do all the right things. We told them to stay in school, and we told them to work hard in school, and they did. And yet, when they come through all of that, our excellent system of education that is supposed to be the great equalizer, they come out of that, and they still look at, say, a booming tech sector in the downtown of Toronto and ask themselves the question, well, how do I get to be part of that? And if you sort of think about the wonders of electronic application for jobs and how that is all handled in that way, there's also a downside to that, which is that the electronic application for jobs can just kind of cause people to be weeded out with never any personal contact, you don't really ever know who you can speak to about the application you send in. And as a result, I think the results show that people from the northwest and northeast corners of our city, places of lower income, places of more racialized communities and so on, find a greater obstacle in their way to get positions and to find positions in the tech boom or in the financial services sector or any of the other sectors that were before the pandemic and will once again boom. And I think it's because we just haven't been prepared to look outside the box and sort of look at maybe even old-fashioned ways. One of the things we did in the city was to sponsor a job fair up in the northwest corner of the city, focused on some of the communities that were finding it difficult to get access. And lo and behold, when that was done, people got hired. Lots of people got hired because they had, to come back to something that was said in the panel previously, they had the credentials. They had gone to school. They'd gone to college. They'd gone to university. What they found was the difficulty in kind of entering into the system and getting that first chance. And I go back to one of the first programs we ever ran. In fact, it was the first program which I sort of served as a volunteer after I lost an election in 2003 for mayor. And I phoned David Pico and said I was going nuts 24 hours after I finished the campaign because I had nothing to do. And he put me to work going out to recruit companies to create positions for newcomers to get a chance to show their stuff with employers. I forget the name of the program, to be honest. I shouldn't, but I do. And 80% of those people, when they got a chance to go in and show what they could do, and this is back to that whole question of credentials, they kept the job as a permanent job later. And I think we've got to go back to that sort of thing. But whatever we do, I'm not the one that's going to have all the ideas. I think employers have to make a much bigger effort in the private sector to modify their recruitment methods. And I think the point that Nick made just in the tail end of the panel is also good for government and good for private sector too, which is it isn't just about the hire, although I would say a lot of this stuff is about getting to the hire for people who are in underrepresented communities in business. And then after that, I think there have to be programs inside that make sure people can rise up through the ranks with some perhaps extra support or extra accommodation. And I know this is true in the police service, where you see number of people qualified based on years of experience for interviews for promotion, and you see a number, and then you see the number who had an interview and the number who actually got the promotion. And to be frank, in some cases, you see an underrepresentation of those who make it to the next step. And that's a shortcoming of our program, which we're setting about to fix now, so that the ranks of the police service can become more representative. For government, I would say that government has to get serious about mental health. And that is one of the topics you're talking about today. And when I say get serious, I will share with you a conversation I've shared before publicly. I had with the Prime Minister of Canada sitting in this office at City Hall. And I said, you know, I was heartened to see that the Government of Ontario and the Government of Canada signed together an agreement on mental health, to which they respectively committed over 5 years billions of dollars. But I said to him, as respectfully as you know I would, I haven't seen any indication of where that money is being invested, like with my own eyes, just in terms of the problems we face at the very ground level in the city. And I'll tell you a story about that, I mean, which is a simple story, but it's a sad story. We put many, many more outreach workers outside of the supervised injection site near the Dundas, Young Dundas Square. And they came back and reported great success, those outreach workers, at convincing people they should go and get a drug treatment program, because that was, all, after all, a large part of how you could basically reduce the need for those kinds of places and reduce some of the social unrest that was happening outside. And the sad part they had to report to me was that when they finally convinced people, who are often difficult to convince, to come in from sleeping rough in the street or to come in and get help for a drug problem, there were no programs to send them to. And how can this be? How can this be that we would invest the resources? And part of this is the complication of government. I've talked often when I said affordable housing and childcare. The areas of housing and childcare, and this is something I hope you can chew on a bit today, are so complicated in terms of who's actually responsible and how people pay, that it's almost impossible to actually hold anybody to account and get anything done, because it's this mishmash of governments, and one comes and the other one goes, and then one goes and the other one comes, and you never really figure out who's going to pay for it, because in the end, it is about the money in large part. So I think on mental health, we have to see governments get serious, but I think it has to be primarily the provincial government, just because it is part of the healthcare system. And then finally, because I was told if I didn't speak in 5 minutes or less, and I think I'm probably at about 4.5 now, a lightning bolt would come down into my office or some bad thing. I was a talk show host. I talked for 3 hours every day. People, I think, have to keep going on some of these partnership initiatives. And this is right up the alley of government, business, and of civic action. You know, we did a lot, and this was referred to again by the panel. We did a lot during the pandemic. We're doing a lot to make sure elderly people aren't lonely. There's these phone trees that have been established with the help of organizations like United Way and Red Cross. We've had food security programs that have had massive volunteer input, as well as corporate participation, as well as government leadership. So you had a library devoted to a temporary food bank, funded and kept in stock by private sector people, and actually run by somebody like Daily Bread as a nonprofit organization. Those partnerships can't be a pandemic thing. But we also have to get beyond the point where we sort of conclude that government, whichever government you're talking about, is going to be all things to all people and being able to address all those things. We simply can't. We simply can't, because we don't always have the expertise or the connections into the community, and because frankly we can't afford just to say everything is going to be thrown onto the tax bill. So we need those partnerships, and we need them because they have the passion of volunteers brought to them and the passion of organizations like CivicAction, and because we have the philanthropy of corporations and others who make these programs work. And I think that applies to food security, it applies to elder care, it applies to the homeless populations, where we need those kinds of partnerships to continue. And it very much has to do, in many cases, though not all, with mental health. And then the final point I will make when we need people's help is we need people's activism on the subject of long-term care. If you think about it, I think arises out of a sense we've had in our culture over time, that because we sort of look to the government or to somebody else in the private sector to look after people who are elderly, who are after all our parents and grandparents, that we've sort of absolved ourselves of responsibility for this and passed it off to somebody, whether it be a private sector operator of long-term care or the government. I'm not excusing anything that went on in that sector. In fact, we're going to have an objective inquiry to figure out what did happen. But the bottom line is we did not meet our own standard here. And I think it's going to be activism on the part of people and figuring out answers as to how this is going to be remedied that's going to make sure we find a fix for that, because it was, it was a revelation, and yet it wasn't. I mean, this issue's been debated. I was a provincial politician for a while. It's been debated for decades. So I'll just stop there. It was a bit of a moving around through the topics you talked about, but certainly to me, there are some things there for me that are assignments. If I'd named affordable housing, by the way, as the one issue, I would have said, we have to fix the fact it takes so long. And we're proving this with modular housing. I said to our people here, I was hurt by the fact that China made a big deal of the fact they could build a hospital in 2 months or whatever it was they did. You know, it was written up here every day as a marvel. So we're doing some modular housing here in Toronto, which is supportive housing for the most in need. And from the start of the day I said I wanted it done in June to the day people move in September, we will prove that we can do these kinds of things too. So we have to have the will, we have to have the willingness of government to get out of the way in some respects and just say we're going to do it. And I think with affordable housing, it fits in that regard. We got to have people put aside some of their own concerns about having that sort of housing or that scale of housing in their neighborhoods. We've got to get government moving faster on the approvals, and we've got to supply the money. It does come back to money in many respects. So thank you very much for inviting me to participate. I hope some of that gave you food for thought beyond what was a wonderful panel I heard. And I may be able to stay for a little while yet. I've got to go make an announcement very shortly about masks on the TTC, but I'll stay for as long as I can. Thank you so much.
And thank you so much, Mayor Tory, for your words. And thank you, Rob McIsaac, as well, for your great introduction. Something that you said that really stuck out to me was, in your description of Mayor Tory, was the test of leadership is how you rise in times of crisis. And I think we all can acknowledge, based on the learnings that we've had today, that this is a time of crisis, but it's also an opportunity to build back better. And again, Mayor Tory mentioned the convening of usual and unusual suspects. That's what CivicAction is all about, convening all of the right people. And we're really excited that all of the right people are on this line today. And you have the opportunity to take this moment in time to not just be here, but to put your thoughts, your ideas, your collective power into action. So here's what's going to be happening for the rest of the day. For those who are attending a lab today, please refer to your pre-event email that you received on June 9th, and it has the links to the labs. A reminder that the re-employment lab is at 10:30, in 10 minutes, and we'll go to 12:15. So take an extremely quick break and log back in. The mental health well-being lab is going to be at 1 p.m. and will run until 3 o'clock. For those who have registered into the Trust Lab, we'll see you tomorrow bright and early at 9 a.m. Before we quickly depart, I want to extend a big thank you to the team action who you saw in the chat, consisting of Cynthia, Maya, and Miriam, who have worked so tirelessly to make sure that this event runs smoothly and that we look and sound good. Thank you so much for your tech wizardry. We also hope that you join us tomorrow at our closing session at 11:15 a.m., where you will get a chance to hear and report back from the labs and the speakers, and hear from the Honorable Rod Phillips, Ontario Minister of Finance. Thank you all so much for taking the time to spend with us this morning, and let's make this an impactful day and a half for our region.